but Joint Intelligence Committees, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have been saying since April that Soviet entry into the war will convince all Japanese that further resistance is futile. The Soviet entry will end the war. The Americans knew that. American intelligence was saying that. And so in early June, former Japanese Prime Minister Hirota met with the Soviet ambassador in Tokyo, Malik, several times. And Malik writes back to the Kremlin, the Japanese are desperate to surrender. So that when the United States drops the bombs, the Soviets knew that the Japanese were not the target because they didn't need the bomb to defeat Japan, that the Soviets were the target. And the American reports after the war said that explicitly. The Strategic Bombing Survey effectively says that. The War Department's report after the war says that. Prime Minister Suzuki, when he was asked on August 13th, the day before the Japanese surrendered, why they had to surrender so quickly, he said, because I can find you the exact quote, because the Soviets will be in Japan. Let me give you the Suzuki's exact words. He says, I can't delay. If we miss today, the Soviet Union will take not only Manchuria, Korea, Karafuto, but also Hokkaido. This would destroy the foundation of Japan. We must end the war when we can deal with the U.S. And the U.S. lets them keep the emperor, which was their main goal. But if you go to the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, the official Navy Museum here in Washington, D.C., they've got an exhibit on the end of the war. And it says, the vast destruction reached by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki made little impact on the Japanese military. However, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria changed their minds. So even the Navy Museum admits this now. So as American military leaders and historians, but that the movie doesn't deal with that at all. The movie justifies the atomic bombing as necessary to get the fanatical Japanese to surrender without an invasion. It overall makes Oppenheimer too sympathetic. It shows that Oppenheimer was later vilified, and he lost his security clearance in 1954, largely because of his opposition to building the hydrogen bomb. But why did he say that? He said that because he said it will divert America's resources and attention from making more atomic bombs. He said, we can wipe out the Soviet Union with atomic bombs. Let's make more of them. We don't need the hydrogen bomb. But it looks like the movie makes it look like he was a martyr, that he was so principled in opposing the hydrogen bomb because it was a weapon of genocide. And he wanted to make more atomic bombs. So even though he did call for international control, even though he was racked with guilt about using the bomb, even though he did go tell Truman, the movie has a scene where he says, I fear I've got blood on my hands to Truman, and Truman throws him out of the office, says, I've got the blood on my hands, and calls him a crybaby scientist. You know, Oppenheimer did feel guilt about his role, but it didn't stop him from supporting atomic bombs, wanting to make more atomic bombs, wanted the United States to always have the upper hand and the superiority. And so, you know, Oppenheimer is a complex figure. The movie makes him a complex figure, but it makes him more sympathetic and more moral than he actually was. And in terms of other criticisms, the movie does not deal with the first victims of the bomb test on July 16, 1945 in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the Trinity test. The General Groves, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, and Oppenheimer were both warned that it was going to create a lot of radioactive fallout and would be very dangerous. Well, the fallout extends initially more than 150 miles. It blankets an area with 500,000 people and many Native American tribes. And had the wind shifted, it could have wiped out much of Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And they knew that. and they went ahead with the bomb test anyway. And then they issued cover stories to lie to the people in New Mexico and Arizona and Texas who were affected by it. And so the fallout, radioactive fallout, fell for 3 days. And this ash fell from the skies, and nobody was warned about it. And children played in it, and they ate it, and the contamination was terrible. And the people in New Mexico who've never been compensated for this, they died of cancer. Their children died of cancer, and they're not included in the Compensation Act that Congress passed in 1990. And the government lied about it. And the leaders in New Mexico wanted Nolan to put this in the film, but he refused to mention it in the film. They could have done it easily in a sentence or two, at least warning about it. But that would have put Groves and Oppenheimer in a more complicated position morally. So they didn't do that. They also don't show any of the Japanese victims. There's no showing. It would have been hard to. The movie is 3 hours as it is, so you couldn't really do that fully and show what they wanted to show, with a lot of emphasis on the trials in the 1950s, security hearings. But they could have done it in a more sympathetic way, shown the victims. They have, after the bomb wipes out Hiroshima, they show a scene where the scientists are all cheering and chanting Oppenheimer's name, and they want him to go up there and say some words, and Oppenheimer does give a speech about how successful the bomb was. And what Nolan shows is in Oppenheimer's mind, he's picturing his audience being incinerated in an atomic explosion. But they don't show the victims in Japan. I did an interview a few days ago with the Mainichi Shimbun, one of Japan's big newspapers, and they're not showing it in Japan yet. That's why I'm glad they're showing it in Vietnam, but they're not showing it yet in Japan. And there's a lot of opposition to it in Japan because it doesn't deal with the Japanese victims. It justifies the atomic bombing. Japanese feel that it's cruel and insensitive. And I understand why they're saying that. To the movie's credit, it does warn from very early on that they were beginning a process that could end life on the planet. It does show Edward Teller as early as 1942 wanting to build the super bomb, the thermonuclear bomb, the hydrogen bomb, that would be thousands of times more powerful than the bomb that wiped out Hiroshima. So it does show that reality, and the movie is strongly anti-nuclear. Nolan's message throughout is that nuclear war is insane and not acceptable. And so that's good. And the other positive thing about it is sparking a big debate in the United States and elsewhere about the atomic bombings in 1945, about the use of the bomb today, about nuclear threats, about the modernization of the nuclear arsenals and the nuclear buildups. So that is a good thing. It's a really good thing because there's not been a lot of discussion in the United States about that. So I think that that's very positive also. So that's why I think overall it's a really good movie. It's compelling. Everybody I know who's seen it, whether they're historians or nuclear experts or just average people, say they love the movie. They never were bored. They learned a lot, made them think. And so I guess that's as much as you can ask. But as a historian, I'm sorry that it reinforces the worst myths that are out there. For example, the New York Times reporter on physics and astronomy, Dennis Overby, wrote about the movie, and he wrote, "The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war against Japan in 1945. The bombing didn't end the war. The Soviet invasion ended the war." But that's this justification that's given over and over and over again for the bombings. And that's where the movie falls most short.
Thank you.